Hi everyone! Thanks so much for joining us this afternoon as we go over DOT 101 Basic Overview. My name is Cassie Hopkins and I help coordinate the webinars here at Hausman Group. Thank you so much for coming and tuning in live, and thank you if you are joining by recording as well. I'd like to go over a couple housekeeping items and then we'll get right into everything. First, this webinar is recorded, so you will receive a link to that recording as well as a copy of the webinar slides. You're welcome to share those with whoever you would like to, or if you can't make the webinar for the full time, you can always resume using the recording as your guide. Secondly, we'd like to save all questions for the end because Ken has quite a lot of content to go through today. So if you would keep your questions for the end, or you can type them into the question or the chat feature and Ken will answer them after he has covered all of his content. We're hoping that we can make it through, but this will be a crunch just because there is so much to cover. This is the first part of a 3-part series for a DOT. We also have a 102 and 103, and there will be a link for you to register if you'd like to go to those webinars as well, and that will be dropped in the chat feature as well. Also, we would love if you would take our survey at the end just to let us know what you thought and let us know if there's any ideas you have for future webinars for next year. It's crazy to think we're already planning for those, but we are. So without further ado, Ken is exhibiting our core value of humble confidence and would like me to skip over his bio so we can get straight into it. Welcome, Ken.
But we do have some of the differences between Wisconsin and federal regulations. You'll hear me talk a lot about the difference between a commercial motor vehicle and a CDL vehicle. And that's a big difference because some of the regulations kick in at 10,001 pounds, which is a commercial motor vehicle. Others kick in at CDL weight, which is typically 26,000 pounds. And there are some other reasons why you may have a CDL vehicle. I have a few companies that got in trouble for not having DOT numbers on their doors, on their trucks, and we'll talk about when that's required. Talk about where your driver files need to be at, whether you're, again, crossing the state lines or not. Medical cards, again, difference between some of you that have vehicles that are over 10,000 and some of the other over 26,000. What needs to be in those driver files. We do actually have another webinar coming up. I believe that one is in December. It's, I think, our 102 series, which is all on driver files. So we'll talk a lot more in that one about what should be in there. How do you get driving records? A lot more details about what should be required there. Medical cards, again, there's some people that are grandfathered and not. There are people across state lines and not. We'll talk about what's required for your federal medical cards. Drug testing requirements, hours of service. Talk a little bit about the maintenance aspects of that, what's required, again, with your vehicles that are over 10,000 or not. And then last one is a late ad here today because I just got a question on this, but the difference between the International Fuel Tax Agreement or the IFTA requirements or trip permits, because if you are going to cross state lines in typically a CDL vehicle, you are supposed to be doing something so that the fuel tax gets split between the states that use it. You can't just jump in your truck and drive across state lines. So there are some requirements there. We'll just touch on the high points with that one today. So again, the difference between interstate and intrastate regulations. Intrastate means you are staying in one state. And again, for today's webinar purposes, we're going to talk about Wisconsin regulations here. You should check out some of the specific requirements for the states that you're in if you have people that are based in Illinois or some other state. You may have some unique things, but you'll kind of get a sense for how the state of Wisconsin adopted most federal regulations. Most states did pretty typical things. There are some unique things that every state has, whether it's how CDLs are required, certain things that you're allowed to have, like in Wisconsin. If I'm staying in the state of Wisconsin, I can actually have insulin-dependent diabetes and still drive a CDL vehicle. Federal regulations don't. So there's some differences that we'll talk about today on that one. If you stay within the or across those state lines, you're considered an interstate carrier. And again, in an interstate carrier, you meet all the requirements of the federal motor carrier regulations. One of the kind of unique things with the interstate regulations is you don't necessarily have to leave the state of Wisconsin to be an interstate carrier. I don't think this applies to many of you, but if you are picking up something that maybe a semi dropped, I'll use the example of a load of mail. Maybe you had a semi dropped it off in Kenosha, you picked it up in Kenosha and drove it to Madison. Because the mail that was in that semi is manifested from a bunch of different states all around the country, that load that you're shipping is actually an interstate shipment, which means actually you still have to follow the interstate regulations. For the most part, I think the clients that we deal with, that's not as common. And I think if you are dealing with those type of things, you're probably an interstate carrier anyways, but we will talk about those, get into the difference here. Again, just be aware, inter and intra, and I've tried to highlight the difference in red on some of those things so that you kind of get an idea for which regulations apply to you. For the people that are stuck here in the state of Wisconsin and don't leave the state of Wisconsin, the state of Wisconsin back a bunch of years ago needed to come up with some type of federal regulations, some type of regulations for commercial motor vehicles. And rather than create their entire list of everything that they needed, they basically passed what's called Transportation Order 327. And you can Google Trans 327 and it'll be about a 2 to 3 page PDF document. And essentially what it says is in the first 3 or 4 paragraphs, it says that the state of Wisconsin adopts everything the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration has in place for interstate regulations, with a few exceptions. And that's where the next page and a half or so come into play as it talks about the exceptions to the federal rules. So there are a handful of things out there that are different. A big one is that Wisconsin adopts a lot of things at CDL weights, where commercial motor vehicles kick in at 10,000 pounds. So the federal government said it applies at 10,001. State of Wisconsin for things like hours of service don't apply until over 26,000 pounds. Hours of service being one of the big ones. Driver files I put in italics here because the State Patrol has said that that does not apply to anybody unless you're over CDL weight in Wisconsin. I would suggest doing some of those things as well, because even though it may not be required, there's still things that are insurance carriers are going to ask you to do, like your annual MVR reviews and those type of things. So I still think it's a good idea. There are some things obviously that don't need to be in a non-CDL driver file if you're not leaving the state of Wisconsin. Leaving the state of Wisconsin with it, again, all that needs to be in place. But medical cards. You do not need a federal medical card to drive a vehicle that is not CDL weight in the state of Wisconsin. We'll talk about those differences a little bit more when we get to that slide here. And again, there are some differences in the hours of service regulations as well. So we'll compare those differences just a little bit so that you get an idea for what's required if you're crossing the state lines or not. So again, intrastate regulations, if you Google Trans 327, you'll get about a 2-page document that walks you through the differences between federal regulations and not. So when we started this presentation here today, we talked about what is a CMV, what is a CDL weight. And I mentioned that was going to be one of the big things that we talked about here today. Difference between the two of those starts at the CMV weight. So again, at 10,001 pounds, you are required to do pretty much everything in the federal motor carrier regulations. And that doesn't change if you're in the state of Wisconsin or not. CMV weight is 10,001 pounds. It is considered the gross vehicle weight rating. So it doesn't matter how much your vehicle weighs, it's how much the tag in the door says that it's able to haul if it's fully loaded. Give you a quick example on that. You can buy a 3/4 ton diesel pickup truck that has a gross vehicle weight rating of about 12,000 pounds. That is a commercial motor vehicle all by itself. It does not need a trailer on it. You can also buy that same exact vehicle that General Motors has derated down to about 9,900 pounds. Only difference between the two of those is one of them requires a DOT number on the door, and a lot of these federal regulations kick in. The other one does not. So again, we've actually had a client of ours that was traveling across the state lines in a vehicle they just bought that had a higher gross vehicle weight rating than some of their old ones did. Got in trouble for not having a DOT number on the door. It can also be the gross combination weight rating of the vehicle, which means that your vehicle inclusive of a trailer is over 10,000 pounds. Typical half-ton pickup truck has a gross vehicle weight rating of about 7,000 pounds. I know mine is about 7,200 pounds. I have a trailer that is almost 3,000 pounds. They derated it just under 3,000 pounds. That vehicle in combination is 10,200 pounds, give or take a couple. That is a commercial motor vehicle if I'm using it for commerce, because I use it on my weekends. It is not for commerce, so I will never be a commercial vehicle with that unless somebody pays me to start doing work with it. But that could, in theory, be a commercial motor vehicle in combination. because the gross vehicle weight rating of the two of those is over 10,000 pounds. Doesn't need a CDL yet, but it is subject to a lot of the federal regulations that it will go through on the bottom here in a second. It can be the gross vehicle weight. So I can have my pickup that I overloaded heavily and put it at 10,200 pounds all by itself, and probably not safe to drive down the road that way, and you're going to have other issues, but that in theory became a commercial motor vehicle because I overweighted it. Can also be the gross combination weight, or it can actually have some placardable quantities of hazardous materials. Technically, that becomes a CDL in that situation. But if any of those are true, Parts 387, which gets into insurance requirements, Part 390, which is just general regulations that apply to commercial motor vehicles, Part 391, which talks about the CDL requirements. And again, there's differences for vision and diabetes that cross between inter and intrastate regulations. Part 392 gets into all the safe driving rules, load securement. All those things are going to apply when you cross over 10,000 pounds. And Part 393 gets into all the maintenance things, what lights are required. Parts 396. Sorry, my screen is cutting off on me here and it's flipping backwards because it's opposite sides from when I usually have it set up here. Hours of service regulations, Part 395. Again, we talked a little bit about the altered hours. There's another slide coming up on that. But the other one that's big here is inspection and maintenance. You're required to have a DOT inspection on your vehicles if it's over 10,000 pounds. All those things are going to apply when you cross 10,000 pounds. Go to the next one. CDL required vehicles. Again, really is over 26,000 pounds is what we talk about when we talk CDL vehicles. There are some requirements for hazmat, which we'll talk about. And if you have 16 passenger vans, those are considered commercial motor vehicles because of the capacity of the van. But for the most part, we're talking weight here. So if we have a weight of the vehicle or gross vehicle weight rating of a vehicle, truck all by itself, that's over 26,000 pounds, that is a CDL vehicle. If you have a truck inclusive of a trailer that weighs over 10,000 pounds, that together add up to 26,000 or more, actually more than 26,000, that is also a CDL vehicle. Picture coming up of how that can change. Wisconsin adds two different things here. Wisconsin, you can actually be considered a CDL vehicle because of your actual weight. So again, you maybe overloaded that vehicle that together was only supposed to be 25,000 pounds, but you got an extra 1,000 pounds on it and it became over 26,000, or the registered weight. And when you register your vehicles, you can put tag ratings on them that change. I'm not telling you to underrate your vehicles because you can also get in trouble for registering it too low and having overweight on them. But you can be pulled out of service for not having a CDL for somebody who's driving a vehicle that was registered too high as well. Hazardous materials could be a seminar or webinar all by itself. I'm going to leave this one pretty short and sweet here. I've got just a couple slides on that, but PHMSA, which is the Pipeline Hazardous Materials Safety Administration, has a list of things that require it. We'll talk just briefly about that, but essentially the placarding requirements. If you have a load that requires placarding because of PHMSA, you are a CDL vehicle. And I do have some examples of that coming up. The only two things that really apply to most, again, this is federal regulations, is Part 382 and Part 383. 383 gets into all the CDL requirements. Again, how old do you have to be, all the requirements for losing your license and those type of things. Part 382 is drug testing. Your drug and alcohol substance abuse testing requirements. Those are CDL things. You don't need to do drug testing unless you're a CDL weight vehicle. So that is the two big differences that apply to CDL vehicles. So mentioned an example here. So this truck, inclusive of this trailer, if this is a 3/4 ton pickup, it is pulling what I believe to be a 12,000 pound trailer based on the 12U that I see on it. But that pickup is probably about 12,000 pounds for a 3/4 ton pickup, pulling a 12,000 pound trailer. That is 24,000 just over in combination. Trailer is over 10, but the combination of those is not over 26. That would not be a CDL vehicle. If, though, I'm wrong in my assumption, and this is a 1-ton vehicle, that 1-ton vehicle has a 12,250 pound gross vehicle weight rating, and maybe your company decided to buy a little heavier duty trailer, and it bought a 14,000 pound gross vehicle weight rated trailer, the two of those together becomes 26,250 pounds. That would be a CDL class combination of vehicles. So you cannot drive that without a CDL if it weighed over 26,000 for the combination, because the trailer is over 10. You can have a 25,000 pound box truck that you put a 9,000 pound trailer behind. Those two things in combination are only 34,000 pounds, which is over 26, but because the trailer was not over 10, it is not a CDL weight vehicle. So again, it has to be over 10,000 for the trailer, over 26,000 for the combination. In that situation, it becomes a CDL class vehicle. The hazmat endorsement and the CDL rules. Again, we touched on the PHMSA thing here just a little bit. There are some slides out there. There's some other things that you can go Google, but just a couple of quick ones on this. For the most part, a lot of the regulations kick in at over 1,000 pounds of most types of materials, unless they're extremely hazardous. There are certain things that you can haul, which is listed on the top here of table 1, that basically any of those in your vehicle requires you to have a CDL with a hazmat endorsement on. So the example that a good friend of mine that used to be FMCSA gave was, if you had a pair of fireworks dealerships and you decided that one of your stores was getting low on bottle rockets and you wanted to run to one of your stores in Kenosha, pick up a bunch of stuff to haul up to Appleton, and you just jumped on your Harley Davidson, you ran to one store, put a bunch of them in your saddlebag and ran up to the other store. You would technically need a CDL with a hazmat endorsement to run those fireworks between your stores, because it's in commerce, and explosives being in table 1 on the top of that list, any quantity of explosives requires you to have a CDL endorsement. Now, there is some exemptions here for what they call materials of trade. So a lot of our contractors that we insure probably have Hilti guns that use those powder activated nail guns to shoot nails into concrete and steel. They use essentially a 22 load to fire the round. Those can be considered a material of trade. So depending on how much you haul for that, you can have some of that stuff in your vehicle because you're using it to basically do your business, right? You can't put boxes into this concrete ceiling without them. There is some exemptions for that. They have to be properly packaged, secured, so they're not rolling around. Like gas cans is another one there. Driver's supposed to be aware of the material of trade exemption if they get asked about it. So I've never had a contractor get asked about the material of trade, but there are some exceptions to that whole rule that it has to be placarded. It would behoove you to read the material of trade exemptions and make sure your driver understands what that is before you get pulled over, because they can get asked for that. So that is the Cliff Note version of hazmat endorsements. I know we could spend a lot of time on that. A lot of things kick in at 1,000 pounds, unless it's material of trade exemption. There are some very hazardous things that you do require that. So again, whether you need a CDL or not depends on whether it's a placardable quantity of the particular type of materials that you're using. So I mentioned the DOT number. That is kind of the first thing we'll talk about here today as far as what's required. And again, I've tried to spell out here whether it's a CDL thing or a CMV thing. It is a plus 10,000 pound issue here for both intra and interstate carriers. So again, if your vehicle is rated to haul more than 10,000 pounds, it's supposed to have a DOT number on the door. It also covers passenger vehicles for hire that are more than 8 people, or 15 passengers, more than 15 passengers if it's not for hire. So if you have a 16 passenger van to haul a bunch of your crew from site to site, that is still considered a DOT commercial motor vehicle. Needs a DOT number on the door, needs to have either your legal name or a doing business as on the door. If it's on there, it needs to be on both sides. It's supposed to be in letters that contrast with the background of the vehicle and be legible from about 50 feet away in the daylight. Don't know if that's ever going to be an issue for you, but again, you should have your DOT number on the door if you are over 10,000 pounds. Again, very simple regulation there. If you go to the DOT website or Wisconsin DOT and say, do I need a DOT number? There's a neat little brochure out there too that talks about whether you need it and how to get one. So if you don't have one already, you need a DOT number. If you have a DOT number, you also have to do a biennial update to that DOT number. So again, you log in and you do what used to be known as the MCS 150 form, which at one time was a paper form you had to mail in. Now it's all done online through the registration portal, but it's all based on the DOT number as to when you are supposed to do that. If you look at the last 2 digits of your DOT number, the last one signifies the month. So the 9th month would be September. And the second to last digit being odd or even tells you which year. So if your DOT number ended in 09, it would need to be updated. You have to update your CS 150 form at least by September of every even numbered year. Does that mean you can't do it in June? Nope, you can do it earlier. It just has to be done by then. Simple requirement is basically going to ask you how many miles you drove, how many vehicles, how many drivers, some basic information about your company. It does not take a long time to do, but somebody needs to update the MCS 150 information every other year for your company. Driver files, the next big one here. So driver files, when we do mock DOT audits, is one of the big things that we focus on because there's a lot of things in there that can get tripped up on. So we do have a full webinar coming up. That's nothing about the driver files, the information that's supposed to be in it. We have some audit forms that you can self-audit it. We can take a peek at them as well. There are some differences here between interstate and intrastate though. According to the State Patrol, this is an intrastate regulation. So again, intrastate, I'm sorry, I said that wrong. According to the State Patrol, it is a CDL weight vehicle for intrastate carriers. So if you're in Wisconsin only, it doesn't really apply to 26,000 pounds. If you cross the state lines, this all applies at commercial motor vehicle at 10,000 pounds. So again, if you're crossing with that half-ton pickup pulling a trailer, you're supposed to have a driver file for your drivers. That includes a DOT application, which is a employment application, but it's DOT specific wording. It's all out on the website. You can find copies of that. You can ask us, we can send them to you. You're supposed to have a copy of the motor vehicle record within 30 days. There are some ways of getting that. Again, PARS is the unique one here in the state of Wisconsin. If you have a multiple state exposure where you have drivers in other states, you're going to want to come up with probably some type of a multi-state search for that. It costs you maybe a few dollars more, but it makes it a lot easier and then it's uniform. Supposed to have inquired to your previous employers. So you checked for background, you did some responses. Hopefully they gave you some information. Some of that has gone away now with the advent of the new Drug and Alcohol Clearinghouse. You are supposed to have a copy of a road test or equivalent. And again, the equivalent part here is if you have a CDL driver, technically they were supposed to have taken their CDL exam in the vehicle that they're going to be driving, or similar one to what they're driving. So they didn't take their semi-truck driver's test in their mom and dad's Honda Civic when they were 16 years old. If you are hiring somebody to drive a 1-ton dually pulling a 10,000 or just under weight vehicle, a trailer, they may not have driven anything like that before. I would suggest doing a road test for those folks because they may not understand how to drive them, how brakes work on a trailer. There are a lot of differences that they may not understand. Again, you should be doing a road test on those type of vehicles because their driver's test they took when they got their license is not necessarily similar to the vehicle they're going to be driving for you. Annual MVRs, again, if you're in PARS, it does allow for employer notification, which means that the state of Wisconsin emails the employer and says something posted to one of your drivers' driving records. You go out and check it at that time and you do the review and said, here's what their driving record looks like now. So there's an annual review of that. If nobody gets notified because you didn't have anybody get a ticket, you don't need to go out and pull everybody's annual if you're doing the employer notification program there. Not all states have employer notification, so there are some nice things being in Wisconsin here because you don't have to pull everybody's driving record every year in Wisconsin. Medical certificates and a check of the National Registry to make sure that they were done properly. That is, again, another piece of the puzzle here for if you're dealing with interstate regulations, you need to have copies of those in your files. If you're dealing with people that are not leaving the state of Wisconsin, that only applies to the CDL weight. And again, I think there's another slide coming up on that in just a second. And then there's also some drug and alcohol information here, basically the driver release part of this form that apply to the CDL weight vehicles again. When you deal with the medical evaluations, again, there's a little difference here between inter and intrastate regulations. If you're crossing the state lines in a 10,001 pound vehicle or more, you need to have a federal medical card, which means that you need to go to a doctor or somebody that's listed on the National Registry every other year, get a physical, and get basically a card that says you're acceptable to drive a commercial motor vehicle. If you have a CDL, you now have to upload that to your driver's license. So you go into the state of Wisconsin, the driver uploads that, and they have to choose whether they're tier 1, 2, 3, or 4. Tier 1 and 2 are people that cross the state lines. Tier 2 is going to be pretty uncommon. It is a few exceptions for people that don't need the federal medical card. Off the top of my head, it's like tow trucks, and there's a couple, maybe a bus driver of some type of emergency vehicles. There's some minor exceptions to that rule. For the most part, if you're crossing the state lines, you need to have a federal medical card. You're going to be a tier 1 driver. There's no restrictions on the tier 1. If you're tier 3 or 4, you're not leaving the state of Wisconsin. Tier 3 means you're grandfathered. So some of you had your drivers or your CDLs back before you needed to have a federal medical card back in '96. If they have a continuous grandfathering of their CDL, they do not need the federal medical card, but they have to stay in the state of Wisconsin. You cannot leave the state of Wisconsin without having a medical card. And again, you've uploaded that now to your CDL license. If you get stopped, you should have a copy of your license with you. They don't need to have a copy of the medical card. I am one of those old-fashioned people. I like to err on the side of caution. I would probably carry my federal medical card if I could. Tier 1, if you do not have a CDL, though, that information does not get uploaded to your license. You need to have a copy of the federal medical card with you if you are driving that vehicle that's between 10,000 and 26,000 pounds. What is it for that one? Drug and alcohol testing is exactly the same for federal as it is for the state of Wisconsin. So there are no differences here. It's a CDL weight thing. You do not need to worry about drug and alcohol testing if you do not have people driving non-CDL vehicles. You are required to have a negative test before they're allowed to drive for a new hire. There are, again, some fairly minor exceptions to that. If they had somebody that was recently tested and tested negative, you are required to have random testing. Typically, you're going to get yourself into some type of a consortium that is a pool of drivers, and it's specific to CDL drivers. It's not your general. You can have a random that includes all of your employees, but you have to have your CDL drivers in a specific consortium that's only for CDL people. Talk to your local drug testing company. If you're not in that, they can set you up in their consortium. Most hospitals or clinics will have some type of consortium they can get you in. You're also required to do reasonable suspicion testing. And I believe that is one of our seminars that we're going to be doing later this year, which is the reasonable suspicion training. You're supposed to have supervisors that get 1 hour of training on recognizing alcohol, 1 hour of testing on illegal substances, illegal drugs, and being able to recognize when somebody's under the influence. So you're required to have all 3 of those plus post-accident drug testing. Post-accident drug testing, if you have a driver in an accident and there is a human fatality, which I'm not sure, I guess you could have a dog that died in an accident, but if there was a fatality in the accident, whether your driver was cited or not, you have to do a drug test on that particular driver. If there was an injury and your driver was cited, they took this person away in an ambulance or treated away from the scene, and your driver was cited, your driver needs to be drug tested. If there was an injury, but your driver was not cited because in theory it was not their fault, the driver does not need to be tested. Same thing with the tow. The vehicles were damaged and either of the motor vehicles required to be towed away. If your driver was cited, he needs to be drug tested. If he was not cited for the accident, no drug testing is required. One of the newer changes to this is the Drug and Alcohol Clearinghouse. This may be something your companies aren't real familiar with if you are just getting into this. I mentioned before that you were at one time required to ask previous employers, has this particular driver received any drug and alcohol testing? Are they subject to any return to duty testing? And there's a bunch of information that they wanted to know before you allowed them to get behind the wheel of a vehicle. Because in theory, they could have gotten drug tested in October, failed it, get fired and come put in an application for you to come work for you in November. And in theory, they should not have been driving because they never completed their return to duty testing. The Drug and Alcohol Clearinghouse is now supposed to clear this up. And before you hire a driver, you go check the national database and you query your drivers to see if they've had any drug and alcohol tests. If they're supposed to have any return to duty testing, any of that information is there. You do not need to ask previous employers that information anymore because it's all here on the Drug and Alcohol Clearinghouse. There's a fee for that. You are required to pay to get a query, and you can buy them in blocks. But then you are also required to test them every year, check that website every year to see if there's something else. Because again, in theory, your driver could have been moonlighting for another company, got a positive drug test. They do not want that person driving for them or for you because they failed the drug test for another company. So again, every year you're supposed to go query this information. You are also, as an employer, required to report anything to them that's a positive, any type of refusal to submit. So you had a driver that maybe was in an accident, was supposed to get drug tested, refused. That has to be reported to the Drug and Alcohol Clearinghouse because they shouldn't be driving for anybody else because they refused your drug test. Okay. If you have any actual knowledge of them using, so maybe you witnessed them using something in the bathroom, drinking on the job, whatever that might be, there's a definition for what actual use is. You're required to report that. Negative return to duty test results and a few other things. There is follow-up duty testing again if they've successfully completed that. Drivers are also supposed to be checking that and verifying that the information is accurate in the website or in the clearinghouse as well. So, hours of service gets into the next part of this. Hours of service on interstates, if you're crossing the state lines, kicks in at 10,001 pounds or greater. If I'm staying in the state of Wisconsin, I'm not leaving the state, I do not need to have a logbook and track my hours of service because it's not till CDL weight. Okay? So between 10 and 26,000 pounds, only if I'm leaving the state of Wisconsin and crossing state lines. If I'm staying in the state of Wisconsin, doesn't apply over 20 until I'm over 26,000. There's daily and weekly driving requirements. Requires proof of daily status plus the previous 7 days, because again, I can't prove that I'm not over my 70 or 80 hour rules if I can't prove what I did for the last 7 or 8 days as well. And there's also an ELD requirement. So electronic logging devices is one of the newer things out there. Newer over the last 5 or 6 years, I guess it is now, but ELDs are required if you're required to do a logbook more than 8 days in a 30-day period. So there may be a lot of us that have trucks that mostly drive within the state of Wisconsin. They run, Madison to Milwaukee 26 days of the month, and that's it. All of a sudden, they have a vehicle that needs to drive to Illinois to pick up a piece of equipment, or maybe you have a new job site down there. When they cross that state line, they are required to keep a logbook if they are in a vehicle that's over 10,000 pounds now. So there is a little difference here between the inter and the intrastate regulations. Talk about that hours of service thing just a little bit because there are some exceptions to that rule as well, mainly the short haul exception. But with intrastate regulations, interstate, that is a typo on this one. Interstate regulations kick in at 11 hours. So again, I can't drive over 11 hours in a 14-hour day. And in between my 14-hour days, I need to take 10 hours off. That adds up nice and neatly to 24 hours, right? So I can't drive more than 11 hours in a 14-hour work shift. I can drive 11 hours and do 3 hours of other work all day long, but I better not get back in the wheel and drive after my 14th hour because I'd be out of service because I was over my 14-hour rule. Again, it restarts every 10 hours. You also have the 60 and 70-hour rule, which means I can't drive over 60 hours in 7 days or 70 hours in 8 days. And that has a 34-hour restart rule. So every weekend, basically, you have to take at least 34 hours off before I can restart that, or my 70 or 80-hour rule is going to get, I'm in trouble with that one. Right? And at some point, you can't drive 11 hours every day for 7 hours straight because I'd be at 77 hours. So again, you have to watch both the 11-hour rule and the 60 or 70-hour rules for interstate regulations. So apologize, that is a typo on the top of that screen. This is not staying in the state of Wisconsin. This is crossing the state lines. There is a short haul exemption, but even if you are crossing the state lines, this is an interstate regulation. Again, I apologize for the typo on this one. Interstate says that if you are driving more than 150 air miles, or I'm sorry, less than 150 air miles, you do not need to keep a logbook because you can be what they call a time card person. And essentially, there's some pretty good exemptions that are listed in the state of Wisconsin regulations, but basically, as long as I started and stopped my day within 14 hours at the same location, so I can't start in Madison, drive to St. Louis, and then work in St. Louis all day. I have to basically go from Wisconsin to Peoria and back again and end my day at the same location I started. Within 14 hours, I can use the short haul exemption for interstate regulations. In Wisconsin, this is correct listed as intrastate. There are similar things, except the hours are a little different. So instead of 11 hours off, or I'm sorry, 11 hours of driving, followed by 10 hours of off duty, it is a 12-hour. So I can't drive more than 12 hours following 10 hours of off duty. So I get 1 extra hour of driving in the state of Wisconsin if I'm a CDL driver in the state of Wisconsin. Again, this is a CDL requirement here in the state of Wisconsin. And when I mentioned that it was interstate, it was a 14-hour day, so I couldn't drive after my 14th hour of being on duty. In Wisconsin, it's a 16-hour day. So in theory, I could start working at 6 a.m., work 16 hours straight, and drive for no more than 12 hours in that 16 hours. And at 10 o'clock at night, I stopped working, but I'd have to take 10 hours off. So now I can't start again until the next morning at 8 o'clock in the morning. Work another 16 hours. I would now not be able to start again until 10 o'clock the next day. It gets a little weird in the state of Wisconsin here. The federal regulations make more sense than the state regulations do. And again, instead of 60 and 7, it's 70 and 7 and 80 and 8. So it was 60 and 7 for the federal, 70 and 8 for the federal. So the hours change a little bit here, CDL only. The short haul exemption, exactly the same, whether I'm staying in Wisconsin or not, but instead of a 14-hour day, again, now they go back to only 12 hours. So in Wisconsin, I need to basically start and stop my day within 12 hours at the same location and all the other things. And I have to be able to produce time cards that show the time I started, time I ended, and the total hours worked each day. Again, I would need to be able to prove that for the last 7 days if I was in the vehicle. Typically, if you're telling the officer that you're a time card person, I'm falling under the short haul exemption, they will allow the office to fax that information over to them. You don't need to have copies of your time cards in the vehicles. But I'm always a little curious when I see these, what are the most common violations you see when it comes to hours of service? And when you deal with hours of service, a lot of it has to do with how accurately they're keeping their logs. And a lot of times it's just that they miss little things like the miles or the locations they stopped at. They're just not keeping them fully. They maybe put the lines on them for the days of the driving time, although not being current is also one of the most common things. So a lot of times it's that they forgot to put their brakes on there. They forgot to mark that they were, stopped for 2 hours or whatever it might have been. They're not current. And that's, again, one of the most common things. You are required to have a 30-hour break after 8 hours of driving. Again, that's one of the common violations. Driving after the 14th hour rule, falsifying your record of duty status, not having the last 7 days of your records so that, again, I can prove what my 80 hours or my 8-day total is. Not having any logbooks at all, 11-hour violations, again, driving past the 11th hour or driving more than 11 hours in a day. And now there's some ELD things in the 70 hours. So there's a lot of violations that apply to hours of service. Again, with crossing the state lines, it kicks in over 10,000 pounds. If you're staying in the state of Wisconsin, it's a CDL weight thing. Maintenance and inspections is one of the other ones here. This applies to all vehicles over 10,000 pounds. And yes, that means if you have a half-ton pickup pulling a trailer and together they're over 10,000, they are supposed to have DOT stickers on them because that combination is a commercial motor vehicle. You are required to do a pre-trip inspection. That is not a documented inspection. That is a walk around the vehicle, check for things that are broken, damaged, missing, lights that aren't working, tires that are flat, those type of things, tread, all the quick things that you can see in less than 5 minutes of walking around a vehicle, probably less than 3 minutes realistically. You are also required to do a daily vehicle inspection report for post-trip inspections. So you are required to document a post-trip inspection, but about 15 years ago, that changed where I don't actually have to document that every day. I now only have to document my post-trip when something is wrong. And I have a lot of people that will say, well, you're supposed to document your pre-trip inspection. And that's actually not true, because if you read the DVIRs, it lists things like brakes and things that you're not going to know unless you're driving this vehicle. That the brakes were chattering, squealing, the car was pulling to the left or the right when you put the brakes on, vibrations and things that just maybe weren't accurate or normal. Those are things that you're going to document at the end of your day on a daily vehicle inspection report. And morning, you make sure that anything that you found was corrected before you drive away in it again. So you're also required to have an annual DOT inspection. Annual DOT inspections can be done by a third party, which takes away a lot of the issues for you. It can be done by your own mechanics if they are considered a qualified inspector. And to be qualified, it basically has to be somebody with knowledge of Part 393, which is all the maintenance standards and the federal regulations, and Part 396 Appendix A, which is the out of service criteria for most of those things. Has to be somebody that can also performs it. They understand what this is, because there are some people that can read the regulations, but they don't know the difference between a brake slack adjuster and a parking brake. And if they don't understand the difference between those things, they can't really be your inspector. And they have to have some type of training experience or both, right? So they have to be able to truly do your inspections of these vehicles. Again, you can have paper copy of inspection, you can have stickers, you just have to be able to prove that your vehicles were inspected on an annual basis. You're also required to have maintenance records of all your vehicles. That's supposed to have your company number on it, if it has it, the make and serial number or the VIN of the vehicle, as well as the year and the tire size of the vehicle should be listed on your maintenance records. And not only do you need that for any vehicle that you have in your fleet, but you need to maintain copies of that stuff for 18 months after you sell one of your vehicles or take it out of service. Again, maintenance vehicles, part of anything over 10,000 pounds needs to have proper maintenance records for those vehicles. So again, here's some of the most common maintenance violations. And if you can see this on your screen, there's a couple of blue boxes here. When I go through this, just for fun, I kind of look at these and I say, anything with that large blue box, there's no way the officer saw that when you were driving past them. The smaller blue box, yeah, they might have, but realistically, they probably had you stopped first, right? So the first small blue box says windshield wipers inoperative or defective. If there's something obvious, they might have seen that there was only one wiper blade and you had it taped out or something. Realistically, if your wiper blades were ineffective, they probably didn't notice that unless they stopped you and climbed up on the step and saw how bad your windshield was. Some of the things like fire extinguishers, the very first one, they had to have you stop before they knew your fire extinguisher was discharged or missing from the vehicle, right? So if you look at that list, there's only about 4 things on that entire list, maybe 5 things that they could see when you were driving past them. When you get to some of these other regulations and you see some of the violations for common driver things, that is not the case. So most of these things here, you need to be stopped before the officer even saw that you had something wrong with your vehicle. Take this to the next level now, the driver portion of this. The most common thing that they get cited for, the very first one, is your typical moving violations, right? Speeding, seatbelt violations, anything to do with, driving too fast for conditions, those type of things. Using a cell phone in a commercial motor vehicle, again, over 10,000 pounds, you are not allowed to touch your cell phone in your vehicle. If you have passengers on board, again, there's 3 or 4 things here that they didn't know until they stopped you that you weren't supposed to be doing, right? Most of the things for driver violations, they can see when you drive past them. Load securement's another one of those things that's a very common violation that you can see it when you're driving down the road. The moral of the story is if you look at a lot of the violations that you get, a lot of times there will be something like a speeding 5 to 10 over, along with a bunch of things like fire extinguishers not being in your vehicles. they've stopped you for something that they saw when they were driving past you. And if I go back to the last slide, the first one on there is not having operable lamps. If your drivers are doing a good job of their pre-trip inspections and checking their lights before they leave, and they're not speeding when they're driving around, and they're wearing their seat belts, which is also a primary, those three things get a lot of commercial motor vehicles stopped. And if you don't get stopped in the first place, a lot of these other things that are listed on this page are not going to get cited. That doesn't mean you can't get stopped at a scale or there aren't some just random inspections that they do, but realistically, a lot of times they've pulled you over because of one of these things, and then you got a maintenance violation for a bunch of different things that they found when they were wrong. And I've seen it where there's literally 15 things listed on an inspection, and it all started because the driver was doing probably 5 to 10 over the speed limit going through some town. The last topic that I was going to get into today, and I know we had this slated for 1 hour, and I was trying to keep this a little short so we had time for questions, but the fuel tax reporting issue. If you are crossing state lines in a CDL weight vehicle, the federal government wants to know how many miles you drove and what states you drove into. And essentially what happens is they split the fuel tax that's been purchased for your commercial motor vehicles and CDL weight vehicles, essentially. And you have two ways of doing that. If you are somebody that does it regularly, you would want to go through the IRP, or the International Registration Plan registration. So you basically have your vehicles listed in the IRP, and then you do a quarterly IFTA reporting. IFTA is the International Fuel Tax Agreement. And again, there's a pretty neat link at the bottom there if you're not familiar with that on the state of Wisconsin. I just Google quarterly IFTA reporting Wisconsin, it'll come up and there's the link to it right there. But it actually has about a 3-minute YouTube video on how to complete your quarterly IFTA reporting. Fairly short and sweet and very helpful when you watch that if you're not familiar with the process. But again, that is for people that do it on a fairly regular basis. If you're somebody that only does it 1 or 2 times a year, you can apply for what they call a 72-hour trip permit. Basically, if I'm going to cross into the state of Illinois, I can essentially file for a trip permit to go down to Illinois. It gives me 72 hours. They estimate the miles and those type of things, but it's every time you do it, you have to redo it, right? Quarterly IFTA reporting is something, yes, every quarter you have to list how many miles you drove, but there's 2 options for doing that. And either way you do it, make sure your drivers are tracking their mileage and saving their fuel receipts, because you're going to want to know how to split those apart. So that, in a nutshell, was our presentation for today. So I do see that I have one question in our chat here. So since I have a little bit of time, you clarify, are these your samples or what could be in a driver file? So there is a full list of information that is required to be in a driver file, and we can send you that information. But a driver file for, again, interstate commercial motor vehicles is supposed to have every one of those things in a separate file for them. And that is something that may never get asked for as long as the DOT never comes in and does an inspection of your company or an audit of your books. But if your maintenance scores or some of those things start getting high, that's usually the first thing that happens. So check that DOT number. Again, if you want a copy of that, we can reach out to you offline and we can actually share a copy of the driver file information. We have a packet that has all the sample forms in it, including the driver's application form. So, not seeing any other questions pop up in the chat. I believe that is all we had for today. So I will stop sharing my screen here, and it looks like I've turned pink again, Cassie.
I know you've turned pink again. I don't know what's happened, but Ken has turned pink. He's really into the Barbie movie, so.
And pink is October, right? It's not No Shave November. It has nothing to do with pink.
Did you? We have one question in the questions part. Do you need to keep maintenance records in the trucks, or can you file them at the shop?
Maintenance records are kept at the shop, so you do not need to keep maintenance records in each vehicle.
Awesome. All right, I am going to, in the chat, everyone, if you are interested in signing up for DOT 102 or 103, you can click on that link that I just put in the webinar chat, and it will take you to the rest of the series. If you're interested in learning more about this, as Ken said, there's a lot more to get into, some more nitty-gritty stuff and some more advanced terminology for the DOT. So I'm really excited that Ken's doing this and sharing his expertise with us. We also have a survey if you would like to, oh, looks like we've got one more person with their hand raised. Angie, if you wouldn't mind typing your question into the chat, we'll be able to help you out here. Just wait for that to come through. But anyway, if you guys wouldn't mind taking that survey, that would be really wonderful for us. We'd love to hear what you're talking about. Oh, raised by accident. Okay, no worries. No worries at all. All right, well, that's all the time we've got for today, folks. Thanks so much for coming in, and thank you, Ken, so much for taking time to educate us on all this really great stuff.
Thank you, and happy Thanksgiving, everybody.
Happy Thanksgiving.